All right. Hello, everyone. JC here with C Column. We're here to give you a little bit of a webinar, podcast, whatever you want to call it, hopefully giving everyone an interesting look at something very relevant to us today, and that is the Spanish flu. But we don't really want to just give you a boring history lesson on this. Rather, we want to kind of give you some insight into how it compares to our current predicament, and that's COVID-19. Both myself and C Column have spent quite a bit time over the last couple of weeks, really diving deep into the Spanish flu, learning more about it, and seeing what's coming out about COVID. C Column was had already just finished a book. Do you want to hold that up for a second, C Column? Show people what you read.
It's this book right here.
Okay.
This book is The Great Influenza by John M. Barry. And there's really two major books about the Spanish flu, and this is probably the main one.
All right, thanks. I myself have been part of a couple free webinars that have been offered through a couple different associations I'm a member of. One of them was a top scholar in the country on the Spanish flu, and then one was actually currently a top researcher at the National Institute of Health. What we will be sharing today is really our own interpretation of the Spanish flu from what we've learned compared to COVID-19 based on what currently we know about it. Understand this has been changing daily rate. If we would have made this a couple weeks ago, excuse me, and been talking about COVID, there might be some different information. So understand some of what we might say today in a couple weeks when referencing COVID, it might be different. So just understand that. But overall, we'll just be sharing what we've learned from these resources and trying to give you some insight. C Column, is there anything that you'd like to share before we jump right into these questions?
Yeah, so I teach my Western Civ kids about the bubonic plague, the Black Plague. And one of the things we talk about is Ring Around the Rosie, that nursery rhyme, and how that may be describing the bubonic plague. Maybe that's a way for kids to cope during this time period. Well, during the Spanish flu of 1918, they had their own nursery rhyme thing that they would sing, usually while they're jump roping. It goes, I had a little bird and its name was Enza. I opened up the window in influenza. And that was a way for kids back then to cope with what was happening. So although there's a lot of differences between the bubonic plague, the 1918 pandemic, and our current situation, I'm going to throw a challenge out there to all the students and say that if you can come up with a little ditty, a little nursery rhyme to try to catch on as a way for you to cope with it, we'll send out some directions for you to be able to share that. We'll pick the one we think's the best. That's all I want to say.
All right, great. So the way this is going to work is we both kind of come up with different questions to ask each other, and then we'll chime in when we have anything to add to the other person's answer. So we'll get started. I will ask C. Colin the first question. Since he read most of the history on it, I will have him give us a quick overview of this disease known as the Spanish flu.
All right, quick overview. So think about it. Over 100 years ago, World War I, America joins World War I in April of 1917. And by February of 1918, we start to see this flu in America. So this is going to go, it's going to start in West Kansas in February of 1918. It's going to spread to a military camp nearby, Camp Funston. And then it's going to spread throughout the military camps. We're gearing up for war. We're training soldiers. Camp Funston, there's 56,000 soldiers cramped together. It is a perfect place for disease to spread. And it's gonna jump around the country, starting with these military camps. And a few months later, it's in the trenches in Europe. And it's on the Allied side. By July of 1918, it's infiltrated the German army and it's affecting them. And this is just the first wave because this thing's going to hit in 3 different waves. So the first wave is pretty mild, but it definitely affects a lot of people, and it's more deadly than the regular flu. But in the trenches of 1918, we're going to see this transform into a much deadlier form. And by August of 1918, this new second wave is going to show up. And it's going to be brought back from the trenches of Europe back to America, and it's going to wreak havoc. And this is going to last all the way up until November of 1918. And then we're going to see a third wave. And the third wave is not as deadly as the second wave, but it's going to be more deadly than the regular flu. And altogether, with these three waves, 675,000 Americans lost their lives. That's more than World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. So this is going to have a huge impact in a short amount of time. Worldwide, between 50 and 100 million people are going to die because of what's known as the Spanish flu. So this is pretty big deal. I'm going to throw it over to Jay Collum because we keep mentioning the Spanish flu. What are the current beliefs around where this originated?
Well, currently there are three beliefs, and it's interesting because we've had all of this time since it's taken place, and we still don't know exactly where it originated from, right? You see a lot of things with COVID, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories on how it originated. But right now, the belief is certainly in China. Interestingly, that's one of the current beliefs that exists with the Spanish flu. One of the beliefs is that it originated in China, where it pretty much was contracted the same way as many are believing today, through a bird, and then an intermediate, and then to a human. And the reason that it would end up spreading around the world is because you had over 100,000 Chinese workers who would be brought to the European front in World War I, and then would spread it that way. So that's one belief. Another belief is that it originated in a military camp in France, where there is a recorded influenza outbreak in 1917, towards the end of 1917. So this would play kind of perfectly into it spreading worldwide by the beginning of 1918. And it's very similar to that China belief. Those are two very strong beliefs. And then there's a third, which I find probably the most interesting, and that is that it originated in that rural town of Kansas at that military camp that you spoke of when giving us an overview. Some of the first reports are coming from that time period. So there is that belief that it could have very possibly originated in America. Now, something very different from today to back then is you didn't really have international travel at this time period, like people taking flights quite yet. So this would make sense if it originated in a military camp when those soldiers went over to Europe. That is when it would spread like wildfire. So those are currently the beliefs that they hold, the three strongest beliefs. Some of them have certain strengths and are very compelling, and then some are kind of lacking evidence. But those are the three that currently are believed to be where the Spanish flu originated.
So I did not hear you mention Spain as where this started. So why is it called the Spanish flu then?
So as you spoke about, the Spanish flu came towards the end of the First World War. And during this time period, Spain was one of the only nations allowed to report certain things, certainly negative things, because they were a neutral country. Most of, especially places like the United States, they had an agreement with the press that there would be restrictions or censorship on what would be reported. And one of the biggest things that they focused on was they were not allowed to report anything negative. Anything that would turn people against the war in any way was not allowed to be reported. So although maybe some people knew about it, it wasn't on the front page anywhere in America especially. Spain was kind of the first to notice that this was a different flu, and because they were a neutral country, they were allowed to report whatever they wanted to. So Spain is really the first country to report it out. Certainly not, we know for a fact that this is not where it originated from, though.
Well, I think that leads us into a really good point of comparison, which is government response. we can compare the way the government did things back then to what they're currently doing. What did President Woodrow Wilson know? Did he know about this? What about the rest of the government, and what actions did they take?
So I want to spend a little time on talking about this because this is a huge difference between back then and today. Currently, the federal government is having a huge influence, right? We see it every day. Trump is speaking every day on it. And surprisingly, there was absolutely no coordinated federal response back then. Wilson never once spoke publicly to the American people during this. And he actually contracted the Spanish flu. He never spoke once publicly to the American people about it. There was no emergency relief, as we see the stimulus that there was no economic aid, nothing like that. All the efforts to contain and treat this were all what we would consider localized efforts. You had cities and towns that really made their own decisions. Seattle, for instance, they completely shut down. New York City, Philadelphia, they stayed open. They didn't restrict anybody on anything. And when we look at what things were put in place, did they do anything? The belief during this time was that germs spread the virus. So there were some similarities to some of the restrictions that they implemented. There was social distancing orders put in place. There was the closure of schools and churches. At least they were, at a minimum, they were made to move things outside. There was even no spitting laws. You couldn't spit publicly because although there was a lack of research and understanding of this, there were some common things that they had figured out such that it could be spread through saliva. But certainly, what you have to understand too is the role that the war had on the flu, right? It's a huge difference from back then to today when we talk about the influence that World War I had. When the Spanish flu breaks out, this is really when America is finally getting involved in this war and going overseas. Although we say we're going to join the war in 1917, it's really not until the end of 1917, early 1918, before we are moving troops across the world. So we are bringing people together in training camps, very, very close quarters they are living. They're traveling all around the world. A huge difference from back then to today. Because of the war, you have a huge increase in factory work because there's a high demand for military supplies being needed. There's demonstrations against the war. There is encouraging people to stand in long lines right next to each other to buy Liberty bonds. So really the war prohibited, even if the federal government may have had more of influence, the war itself prohibited large-scale measures such as a lockdown. You have to have people making war goods. You have to have soldiers in training camps, right? So a good example, Philadelphia, they hold this patriotic parade. Probably not the best thing to do during this pandemic, but they hold it. And the next day there are 600 new cases. So certainly states and cities and towns got to do their own thing. There wasn't even statewide mandates for the most part. And another thing, when we think about medical doctors, over 30% of medical doctors have to go overseas and help with this war effort in the medical field. You have people who are stuck on ships for 3 weeks. If one person is infected on that ship, it's likely the rest of them are going to be infected as well. So certainly different circumstances that they're facing with the war. But when we look at the federal government, what did they know? What did they do? The truth of the matter is they did nothing. And they did know about it, especially once that second wave hit and into that third wave. There was a pretty good understanding what was going on. And when we talk about censorship, there was reporting in the newspapers, but a lot of times you saw, on the back page, a very little small section, and they were in localized papers. So, some major differences in something which we should be thankful for today is the response of our federal government, especially when we compare it to the past.
If I could just piggyback off that, I mean, the big thing is people are afraid to report on this stuff. You had the Espionage Act passed. You could spend 20 years in prison for printing or uttering something that was deemed anti-government, unpatriotic, and if you criticize the government for their response to this, that could be a reason you're thrown in jail. J. Edgar Hoover, he's got the American Protective League. They are spying on fellow Americans to make sure they're not spreading bad information about the government. So this is a dangerous time to speak ill of the government, for sure.
Yes, there would be a lot of people going to jail today if we had similar laws to back then, certainly. So we'll shift gears here and let's talk, as much as I really dislike the science of things, let's talk about the science things here with your question. What about the molecular level? Can you describe this virus, how it attacks, the symptoms it causes, et cetera, and kind of compare that to the coronavirus for us?
Yeah, so first of all, the coronavirus and the influenza virus are two separate viruses, but they are similar in the fact that they are RNA virus. So you've heard of DNA, the double helix. RNA, you have one helix. And viruses are really neat. I didn't think I'd like science so much until I started looking into this stuff. And the book really goes into detail, but viruses are like zombies. They're not really alive, but they're not really dead. They have no metabolic process. Their goal is to replicate. And what they'll do is they'll invade the cell and they'll tell that cell, hey, make a bunch of me. That's what their main goal is to find a cell and to replicate. And both influenza and coronavirus really like the cells found in the respiratory system. So that's another way that they're similar. And influenza A is the only type of influenza virus that causes pandemics. But understand that the coronavirus is the same virus that causes the common cold. So they're both the influenza that hit in 1918 and the coronavirus that's hitting now are more deadly versions of something that is very common. And one of the things that I really find interesting is the fact that the process of going from an animal to a human and how a virus does that. So one of the things that we can look at is something known as antigen shift. And with antigen shift, this virus jumps from an animal. In influenza, we're looking at birds. In coronavirus, right now, the big theory is bats. It starts in bats, but it jumps over. But that doesn't mean that it can spread human to human. That needs another process to take place, and that's known as reassortment, where it mutates and it gives itself the ability to transmit between human to human. And one of the things with the coronavirus is for several weeks, researchers in China are saying to the World Health Organization, we don't see any evidence of human to human transmission. But as soon as that happens, you're going to have an epidemic at least, and maybe a pandemic. So these viruses are really good at mutating. Influenza actually mutates a lot faster and replicates a lot faster than the coronavirus. So that actually makes it a little bit more deadly in that sense. And then finally, this idea of passage, of where a virus becomes deadlier, it evolves over time. Sometimes it becomes less deadly. There's several strands of our current coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic going around. Some are more deadly than others. We've discovered that. Scientists have already discovered that. And we think that that may have been what happened with the second wave, is it went through this process of passage and became deadlier. It evolved. And really, when you look at viruses and the science behind them, it's some interesting stuff for sure. And another thing I want to just throw in there is this idea of a cytokine storm. A lot of what we see as far as symptoms of viruses is our own immune system. And this virus, or the 1918 influenza virus, is really interesting because the people that died the most were healthy young adults between 15 and 34. And the reason is because their immune system was stronger than a normal person's. And the influenza virus would use that immune system against the person. That would be the reason they died, because you'd have these cytokines, these proteins that are attached to white blood cells, and it would be an all-out war. Your body would send all this stuff into wherever this virus was attacking, and the immune response would fill people's lungs with fluid, and that would be what killed them. So the highest mortality of the 1918 flu is actually between the ages of 15 to 34. Now, what I find interesting is they're just discovering right now with the coronavirus, these cytokine storms are also hitting people with and they're needing dialysis machines because the kidneys are suffering because of this immune response. So there's another point of comparison.
Interesting. So you talk about all this science, but really during the time period, what medical knowledge existed at the time of the virus's impact? Really, especially when it hit the worst and the hardest. We have health experts today where they are working on this constantly. Was there someone at the forefront like we see today with Dr. Fauci?
Yeah, so thank God this didn't hit 50 years prior, because we had just discovered germ theory not long before this. And thank God it didn't hit in America 20 years prior, because we didn't even have a medical college that was in any way comparable to what Europe had. They were way ahead of us. But you have this guy named William Welch, who's the most powerful doctor in the US, the most well-known doctor in the US. And he's going to basically develop the Johns Hopkins medical school to train people the way that Europe was being trained. And he's also going to direct the Rockefeller Institute, which is also going to research diseases and try to fix what's going on. There's a lot of things out there, typhus and measles and all these other things that people are worried about. So he's kind of the Dr. Fauci of that time period. The problem is that viruses, no one really knew about viruses. They had discovered bacteria, so they knew germs existed. But so the entire time this is hitting, they're trying to find a cure for a bacterial disease. They think that this Spanish flu is caused by bacteria, and they're developing all of this information with that idea in mind. And that really led us in the wrong direction. And it's going to take a few years for us to figure out that viruses, this invisible pathogen, exists. But yeah, that's where we're at. We're not as advanced, obviously, as we are today. There's no antiviral, there's no viral treatments, there's no ventilators, there's none of this stuff that can help people today. We don't even have antibiotics yet back then. Penicillin hasn't been discovered. But we're way ahead of where we were 50 years ago, like in the 1850s, 1860s. That's all I got. You there?
Yeah, that was good. That was good. Great overview. So,
what can you tell me about some of the major similarities and differences between this real quick?
well, I think you touched on a lot of similarities, especially on the scientific side of things. So after I'm done listing these, if there's anything you want to add, especially the similarities side, certainly do so. But as far as similarities, some of the similarities too that I'm going to talk about are possible similarities as well, because there's still a lot of stuff coming out about the coronavirus. There's still things that are changing that maybe we believe now that might be wrong in a couple weeks or a couple months or a year from now. But certainly one similarity would be that this is a novel virus, that it seems to have originated from a bird and then transmitted to an intermediate host and then transferred to us, right? That's certainly the way it was for the Spanish flu. That's what we seem to be finding with COVID. COVID-19, and certainly it went from a bat, and then there's this possibility of a pangolin, and then to humans, right? Um, Another similarity that we see is obviously this is a worldwide problem that we are facing. We have seen some of these things over the last 20 years, especially labeled as epidemics and pandemics, but they really haven't reached a worldwide pandemic scale that we're seeing here. So that's a major similarity between the two is both of these are certainly at that level that we're seeing. This one is certainly going to be in the history books, just like the Spanish flu was. But probably what's more important to look at and really what's a little bit reassuring when we compare the two are the differences. Certainly one difference is that the understanding of this virus is much better than the understanding of the Spanish flu. As you kind of just talked about, the ignorance behind it or the lack of knowledge behind the Spanish flu. You know, within 2 weeks of COVID-19, in China, there was a published study that contained the full genome of this virus. So we're so much more advanced there. Certainly treatments are 10 times better than they used to be. You know, back then, it's commonly thought that the common treatment was whiskey and an enema. Today, we have antibiotics. Although an antibiotic certainly isn't going to stop COVID, it's going to treat certain complications, especially things like bacterial pneumonia. That's a big one that we can treat now that back then we couldn't treat that because we didn't have antibiotics yet, just like you just spoke of. We have intensive care units. We have pulmonologists, right, that are focusing on the lungs. That we didn't have that specialty. We have infectious disease doctors who specialize, and these people are only studying these things all day. So there's that experience and knowledge there that we didn't have in the past. But probably the biggest difference that I spoke of earlier was the government approach to it and the press's handling of it. Right there was today there's no type of tacit agreement to keep the virus out of the newspapers because it's negative press, right? The government is stepping up in a huge way in America. Trillions of dollars they are giving to the American people to help them at least survive this financially. They're putting restrictions, statewide restrictions. There's just a lot more government intervention. So this is probably one of the biggest differences and really something to be thankful about, that we have updated knowledge every day. We are getting updated briefings on it, whereas in the past, that just didn't happen. So those are some of the major differences. Did you have anything to add to those?
Well, I would just say just the symptoms. There's some differences and similarities with the symptoms. Obviously, one of the biggest causes of death and why we have to have all these ventilators is both the influenza and the coronavirus, COVID-19, are affecting the lungs and they're causing viral pneumonia. But there's a lot of differences too, especially when we're talking about the second wave. So with the second wave, one of the things that would happen to people is because of a lack of oxygen, they turn blue, really dark blue. And these air pockets would exist under people's skin. And when doctors would try to turn people over, it would sound like Rice Krispies, right? These crackling. So that would freak people out. And just one of the scariest parts of this disease is people would bleed from everywhere. They'd bleed from their noses, their eyes, their ears, their mouth. And that's a scary thing. I mean, there'd be puddles of blood with nurses working and trying to help people. But there's a lot of other stuff like temporary blindness, and there's a lot of brain issues with this, long-term effects, where people kind of describe being foggy for months or years after suffering from this. And when we talk about some of the effects, especially with Wilson, that could help explain things. There's issues with where fluid attacks the heart and weakens the vessels in the heart. So there's all these other issues, and we're still discovering what the coronavirus is causing and maybe some of the long-term effects and how people are affected long-term. So that's another point of comparison.
Yeah, and I would just jump into another similarity, really, and it's for opposite reasons, is the worldwide fear that exists, right? Back then, you had this fear because these things that you just spoke of are happening, and people don't really know why. right? There's a lack of knowledge around things. People don't know why. They know bad things are happening, but they don't know where it's coming from, why it's happening, and what to do about it. Whereas today, there's a very similar fear that exists, but a lot of it too is because there's so much information put out, right? And there's so much being put out about the number of deaths and this and that, and the restrictions put on people, that people are overwhelmed. And frankly, sometimes they don't know what to believe, right? Because there's one news outlet reporting, use this, and another news outlet is saying use this, and then people, they're risking their life trying these things that are being suggested. So there's certainly a similarity in the fear that exists, maybe for different reasons, though. So to finish up here, final couple of questions I have for you. What are the short-term and long-term effects of the Spanish flu?
Well, a lot of this is comparable to what we're seeing now. Hospitals are overwhelmed, especially with the fact that you mentioned there's 30% of all nurses and doctors are working for the military. And bodies are going to pile up, and they're not going to have a place to put them. And we see that in some of these areas hit hardest with this coronavirus. Morgues are going to be overwhelmed. Orphanages are going to be overwhelmed because remember, 15 to 34, you have a lot of young parents. Local governments are going to collapse because of this. Philadelphia's government almost collapses because of they're hit hard with that second wave. And one of the craziest parts is we see these rumors. I just saw people talking about this maybe spread through 5G towers. One of the crazy conspiracy theories that emerged during the 1918 flu is in one town thought the dogs were spreading it. So what did? They killed all the dogs in the town. There's a rumor that Bayer aspirin is causing it. There's just all these conspiracy theories, and people are trying their own remedies and what to do because there's a lack of knowledge in 1918. Like you mentioned, there's too much knowledge now. It's too easy to get on the internet and find some crazy conspiracy theory. There's advertisements all over newspapers of people claiming that they have a cure for it. So people are trying to make money off of this. One of the things that I really find interesting are the long-term effects. So resistance fighters in Africa are going to try to kind of be on the front line and help people because of this, and that's going to lead to the apartheid movement. So that's a big effect. It's going to lead to independence in Africa. In India, Gandhi's going to get this. He almost dies. In fact, 20 million people in India die, they think, because of this. It's the hardest hit country. And the reason why he got it is the independence movement in India is really the ones on the front lines trying to help people. They're going to gain in popularity. It nearly wiped out the Inuits in Alaska. It wiped out several languages in South Pacific Islands. Woodrow Wilson caught it during the peace conference. And he was really hard-lined on the fact that we cannot punish Germany too much. He gets the flu. He's incapacitated for several days. And then when he emerges from that flu, he softens his stance, and it allows to that Treaty of Versailles to be super harsh, which historians think is the main reason World War II starts. So you can contribute a cause of World War II to this pandemic. There are several leaders that the Prime Minister of Great Britain, just like our current Prime Minister of Great Britain, catches this. Walt Disney nearly dies from this. Imagine if he would have died. FDR is on a naval ship, and he's going to catch it and nearly die because of this. So, I mean, you can keep going down through. One of the things that I found most interesting is Vladimir Lenin in the Soviet Union, his second in command was not Joseph Stalin. It's this guy named Yakov Sverdlov. He's he's not as harsh as Stalin, not as hardcore as Stalin, and he dies from it, and it allows Stalin to take over. And we know what happens after that, right? I mean, the long-term effects, you could see this up until the 1980s and 90s. We're still dealing with the Soviet Union and the effects from this. Imagine if somebody that was less militaristic is leading the Soviet Union, how that would have changed world history. And we have the CDC established, the National Health Institute established. there's a push for universal health care. And that almost catches on. So there's so many big time effects of this pandemic. It's just crazy.
Yeah, one that I found that was really interesting was the one webinar that I looked at. They said the life expectancy, the worldwide life expectancy from this flu dropped by 12 years. And it's kind of hard to understand what that means. But if we look at the current opioid crisis in America, right, and how bad it is, and how many young people are dying from it, that has dropped the average lifespan in America by 0.01, right? And there are hundreds of thousands of people dying every year from that. And so that was unbelievable to me, that the average life expectancy worldwide dropped 12 years because of the Spanish flu. I thought that was pretty interesting for a short-term impact. So to finish up your last question, what lessons can we gain from this Spanish flu?
Well, one of the things that I found interesting is the case of San Francisco. They got hit pretty hard with the first wave, but they put in mitigation factors. They made people stay home. They closed schools. All these things happened. And it was kind of seen as a success story of what you do and how you deal with it. But they let people go back to normal too early. And they're going to get hit really hard with the second wave. And if we can learn anything, it may be that, this thing might be around for a while until we figure out a vaccine. And we might end up going through this social distancing for quite a while, because when we let our guard down during the 1918 one, it had really bad consequences. I mentioned the conspiracy stories, the lack of information. But one of the things in my book, and I'm going to just read what the author says. He predicts this a decade before it actually happens. He describes the economic fallout. He says this is what will happen if we get hit with another pandemic. And it's like reading a current event. But he says, he talks about leadership. And he says, those in authority must retain the public's trust. The way to do that is to distort nothing, to put the best face on nothing, to try and manipulate no one. Lincoln said that first and best. A leader must take whatever horror exists concrete. Only then will people be able to break it apart. So it's really important for government officials to describe exactly what's happening so people understand, because we didn't have that in 1918. And people were dying left and right, and nobody understood why. And it spread, a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of hate and a lot of issues. So that's probably the biggest one, and that's what the author wants people to take from this.
Very interesting. So that does it for kind of our overview that we have. We appreciate anybody who actually stuck around and watched this thing. I think it went a little bit longer than we both predicted, but certainly very, very interesting thing. I personally teach World War I in my 9th grade U.S. history class. I usually do. Anyways, I teach that and the Spanish flu. And, in the past, it was difficult for me to teach it. It was difficult for me to kind of have the impact that I would have liked it to on students. We usually only had a day or two to talk about it. And it was usually covered through some type of screencast. This has drastically changed the way that I'm going to teach it. I kind of compare it to the 9/11 and teaching of Pearl Harbor, right? It might have been hard to teach Pearl Harbor, but once 9/11 happened, you could certainly bring in that impact of that event, because people have lived through something similar. So this is just really a very interesting thing, and the similarities and differences that exist between both of them. But is there anything that you'd like to add before we end this?
I think we better end it.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for everybody sticking around.